Okay, and I think we'll get started now. Can you close the poll, please, and share the results? Okay. So I'll just have a look at the results. Interestingly, governance at 44%, showing as the area that you're most concerned about when you consider your supply chain, and then environmental at 33 and social at 23. So I think that's interesting, showing that all three of those are very much relevant considerations, and governance just ahead there. So good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to this is the second in our series of ESG webinars. My name's Helen Bowdren. I'm a partner here in the ESG team at Dentons, and I'll be chairing this morning's session looking at ESG and supply chains. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so as we're going through the presentations, please do put your questions in the chat function, and we will try and address as many of them as we can in the Q&A. I'm really delighted to be joined by two panelists this morning, and I'd like to just take a moment to introduce them. Both of them have got a wealth of practical experience in dealing with supply chains, and specifically dealing with sustainability and ethical issues in those supply chains. So firstly, can I introduce Rebecca Law? Rebecca is the head of legal at the John Lewis Partnership, and she'll be discussing the approach that the partnership takes to responsible sourcing. And I think all of us that are customers of John Lewis will know that responsible sourcing is very much at the heart of the John Lewis proposition, and has been for many years. And I would say that they're really seen as a leader in the retail sector on this area. So really interested to hear how you actually do that from inside the organisation, because it's not as easy as it always looks, I think, from the outside. And our second panellist is Emma Mansbridge from the Food and Drink Federation, and Emma leads on environmental and sustainability policy for the Federation. I know it's been a really tough year, challenging year for the food and drink sector. Supply chains were really tested this year, in around March and April particularly. And of course, the sector's looking very anxiously at the moment as well at the prospect of a no-deal Brexit and the impact that that might well have on supply chains as well. So really delighted to welcome you, Emma, and interested to hear what the lessons learned during the last few tumultuous months have been from the food and drink sector. So before we move on to that, I'm going to kick off now with some thoughts from my side as an external advisor on how we as lawyers tend to see ESG issues coming up in supply chains. If we move on to the next slide, please. As we're all going back into various tiers of lockdown, and I'm speaking to you currently from tier 2, I thought it might be timely to have a Zoom quiz. I'm sure we all did plenty of those over the summer, and so you can feel free to play along at home. These are all items which have been very much in the press recently because of the supply chain issues connected with them. Do play along at home. So going through the first one, on the top left, the avocado. There was a story recently that Tesco had taken a decision to terminate a relationship with a supplier, and that was a result of connections with alleged human rights breaches in Kenya. And there's actually a class action against the UK parent company of that supplier currently being brought in the courts in London. Moving on to the cotton t-shirt. Cotton tends to have a very long, very complex supply chain with a lot of sustainability and social issues associated with it, including the use of pesticides to grow the cotton, a high level of water use, high incidence of child labour, and other social impacts. So cotton farmers tend to be very vulnerable to fluctuating market prices, and also the effects of climate change. There's a lot of work going on, I think, within industry bodies to try and address some of those issues. On the bottom left, we've got a lithium-ion battery. Those are contained in so many of the products that we rely on today. Our laptops, our electric cars, mobile phones, and they contain nickel and cobalt, and the mining of both of those can lead to some pretty significant social and environmental impacts. So that's another one, very difficult one to solve, because the world's need for those materials is growing every year. And then in the bottom right, this is one that's perhaps a little less obvious. The mop and bucket is there to represent cleaning services. And recently we did a risk assessment for a client looking at their supply chain, looking particularly, in this case, we were looking at modern slavery risk. And the supply chain was mainly UK. And one of the things that we found that was perhaps surprising was that based on the data published by the Gangmasters Authority here in the UK that regulates modern slavery, they said that there was a very high incidence of forced labour in cleaning services being provided in the south of England. And so as a result, if you were, procuring a contract for those services in that part of the country, that actually there could well be a high risk of some degree of forced labour within that sector. So this isn't always an issue that's necessarily far from home in another country. Moving on to the next slide, please. So why are people thinking about ESG and supply chains? Why have so many of you decided that you wanted to dial in to hear this morning's session? I think there's lots of different factors actually all coming together and influencing this at the moment. Certainly there are some soft law, some voluntary commitments that companies may have taken on, which mean that they need to take a more proactive approach in looking for these issues within their business. So that might be, for example, the UN Global Compact or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, both of which are things that businesses can take on voluntarily. There may be some specific concerns around products. We've talked a bit about palm oil and cotton lithium batteries. There may be some, sorry, I think I'm just having a few connection issues. I hope you can hear me all right. There are some regulatory requirements that drive that. A lot of clients come to us because they are looking to comply with either the Modern Slavery Act in the UK or in Australia, or they need to think about the conflict minerals regulation. There's a French duty of vigilance now on international companies. And also there is a specific consultation here in the UK around imposing mandatory due diligence around forest risk products, and Emma will talk a bit about that later on. But these are some of the examples of legal obligations that might be pushing you to make changes. And then on the bottom row, commercial factors. Another big driver on this is customers requiring action. So you may be tendering for contracts and finding that you're having to take on quite onerous contractual commitments with regard to ESG issues, whether that be modern slavery or bribery and corruption, or perhaps signing up to environmental commitments as well, and that you will need to do so in order to secure certain contracts, and government contracts will certainly include some of those requirements. And also social license. That's a big theme at the moment, that companies feel that they certainly need to have not just the legal licenses and permissions that they need to operate, they also need to operate with the consent and with the support of the communities that they work in, and that being aware of the effect of their business and being responsible and fair in how they treat their suppliers is a big part of actually maintaining that social license. So moving on to the next slide. What about the challenges of addressing ESG in supply chains? And I know from speaking to clients that this is not straightforward. It is actually very difficult to affect change within your organisations. Many clients say, I just don't have that much visibility over my supply chain. That's very common. You may only have, essentially a list of suppliers set up on your system so that they can be paid, but you don't really have much more information than that about them. And you may only see what we call your tier 1 suppliers, so those that you actually have a direct contractual relationship with, but you may not have any visibility about who's sort of further down the supply chain, and that's quite common. Also saying, look, I've got a limited ability to influence or change my suppliers. It may be that you're procuring a very particular type of product or service and it's a very small market and you just don't have the luxury of being able to switch suppliers. Or it may be that the bargaining position is such that you're a small company, they're a very large company, and you just have to contract on the terms that they offer you. We do often see competing objectives, if you like, between procurement and sustainability teams. Procurement may well be very much driven by securing the best commercial deal for the business, and not so much about what the social impact is of those. And so any, I think, attempt to start to manage this is going to have to bring those teams together. And then having limited resources to monitor supplier compliance. You may have lots of good contractual protections, for example, the right to go and audit your suppliers or to do factory inspections, for example. But if you actually haven't got the resources to do that, that's probably not offering you that much protection. Difficulty getting the information from suppliers, that's certainly an issue. And then difficult decisions as well. If you start to look at your supply chain and think about where the environmental or social issues might be, and you find a problem, what is the solution? Is it just to then completely terminate a relationship with a supplier? Or is it that you stay in the relationship but try and essentially effect change through the relationship? And that, I know, is a difficult decision. So moving on to the next slide, these are some of the tools that we will use when we're helping clients to put in frameworks for assessing this risk and then managing this risk. There will certainly need to be a period of engagement and consultation. Internally, you certainly want your procurement team involved in that. If you use a lot of agency workers as well, you might want your HR team involved. Legal, certainly, for those who are signing off on the contracts, would want to be involved, and your commercial teams, as well as your sustainability and ESG teams. And external engagement as well. What I have seen being used very effectively by quite a few clients is actually working with industry groups. So if you've got a particular product or a particular jurisdiction where you know that there are issues, then you can probably affect more change more effectively as an industry group than you can as an individual company. And also working with NGOs, and I've seen quite a few companies do that, where they ask an NGO to essentially come in and look at their processes, look at their systems, and assess them and give feedback. And I think that can be quite helpful. And you'll need to engage with your suppliers as well, and also with your clients. And then the next step is really to look at what your existing controls are. And it may well be that you have a supplier code of conduct already, that you have perhaps some diligence before you onboard a new supplier. Some companies will be doing some monitoring actively during the life of a contract, whether that's audit or inspections, and you may have some contractual protections, some standard wording in your contracts, whether that's around bribery and corruption, and anti-money laundering, or whether it's around modern slavery, or whether it's around environmental issues. So you need to kind of understand what you've got in place currently. And then really to assess the risk. Important to do this across your existing and your new suppliers if you possibly can. And it's, it can be as simple as sort of triaging your suppliers based on different risk factors. There's quite a lot of publicly available data which can help you to do that. And I would say focus on where you can have impact, and focus on where you think the greatest risks are. And it's probably, sometimes clients will sort of triage based on the size of the contract, on the value of the contract. That's not always actually the most useful way to do it, because a contract may not have a particularly high monetary value, but may still pose a significant reputational or other risk to the business if it turns out that there are significant environmental or social issues associated with that supplier. If we move on to the next slide. And some of the tools then for managing that risk when you have sort of mapped your supply chain. Certainly due diligence, you can do that yourselves. You can actually use third parties. There are companies that will carry out that supplier due diligence for you. Think about your contractual protections as well. warranties, termination rights, and if you have termination rights, think carefully about, as a business, how and when you might actually seek to exercise those. Reporting obligations, you might, for your higher risk suppliers, you might require them to report to you, for example, on a regular basis every year or every quarter on what steps they're taking to manage ESG issues. Indemnities, we see sometimes. I'm not a big fan of indemnities. I think for this area, I'm not sure that they provide a great deal of protection, really. The risks that we're talking about tend not to be the kind of risks that are particularly well covered by an indemnity. Codes of conduct, I think a code of conduct can be quite useful because you can sort of update it quite regularly. But again, if it's just a piece of paper, if it's just a tick box exercise, but no one ever really enforces it and no one ever really reads it, it's probably not providing that much protection to you. And then more active management, and this is, the sort of the most difficult part of it in some ways: how you deal with non-compliances, how you deal with concerns, and how you escalate those. And then termination, and at what stage do you actually terminate a contract if you feel that it is posing too much risk to the business, and that might be in the form of reputational risk, or perhaps a commercial risk that you think that an association with that particular supplier is actually going to perhaps cause you to lose other contracts. There's a whole range of factors that you might take into account, and I know that termination will often be a last resort, and may not be an option as well. Contractually, you may well not have the right to terminate. You may be stuck into a fixed term contract, and so there may be penalties for termination as well. So that's always going to be a difficult consideration. If I just move on to the next slide. So that's just to kind of wrap up, really, some of the ways that we look at it from an external counsel perspective. And I'm delighted now to hand over to Rebecca to talk about how that works in the real world when you're at the coalface of doing this within a business. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Helen. So good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca. As Helen said, I am Head of Legal at the John Lewis Partnership. So working across all commercial matters on both brands, both John Lewis and Waitrose. This is a topic that's quite close to my heart, both as a lawyer and a consumer. I think it's just fascinating and so important. So it's brilliant to see it kind of coming to the forefront of lots of businesses' minds. If we could jump onto the next slide. I was really going to focus on two things this morning. Talk about the question of, is this a legal risk or is it a business opportunity? I think there is a carrot and a stick here. So I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about that. And then I was going to go on and talk about what it means in practice and some of what we see and my personal reflections for how we're dealing with this at the partnership. So starting on legal risk, we all have a huge amount of stakeholders that are interested in these questions. We have our suppliers, our employees or partners, as we call them at the partnership, your investors or shareholders, the media, some regulators, and obviously your customers. The mix and the different kind of pull and push of what each of those groups want is going to be different in every single business. But at the partnership, we really do believe that this having a good kind of track record on ESG is a differentiator, and it's a huge carrot for us as a business. It really goes to the core of our purpose. The partnership is 156 years old this year, and we were founded as a better way of doing business. For those that don't know, we are a co-owned business, and we have a written constitution which enshrines at its heart the principles of how we will go about doing business and treating the communities, the suppliers and the people that work for and with us fairly is written down and is kind of at the heart of how we do things. The other benefit of being structured in this way is it allows us to take a long-term view. We may not be kind of pulled by the whim of some of those stakeholder groups that I mentioned at the top. And that allows us to really invest in this area, and as I say, not be swayed by what different people might want in the short term. which is convenient because I think it's never been more relevant. And last week we unveiled our new 5-year strategic plan, and a core pillar of that was our social purpose, and making some really bold commitments about what we will do in this space over the next 5 years. I was just going to mention a few of them before we move on. So in Waitrose, we have committed that we will lead positive change in the food industry. We're committing to source only from net zero carbon farms in the UK by 2035. We're committing to halve food waste in our own operations by 2030, and to extend this commitment to our supply chain too. We've also committed to help UK households halve their food waste by 2030, because we really see this as kind of commitments that need to go out from just businesses into the people that we serve as well. In John Lewis, we really want to make some big steps in the next few years to lead what we're calling made to last movement. We need to make sure that our products are built to last and they can be loved for longer. So the commitments we're making on this side is that all product categories will have a buyback or a take back option by 2025. All key own label raw materials will be from sustainable or recycled sources by 2025. And that we will develop more rental and resale opportunities with an ambition for more sustainable ownership options for our customers. I'm really excited by these commitments, and I have to say we don't have the detail on how we will achieve all of them yet, but we are going to be working through that in the coming months and years. But if we achieve them, which we are confident we will, it will just be an absolute game changer in how we have to work with our supply chains to achieve these goals. I'm already sort of got our teams thinking ahead to kind of how will we get visibility that we can make these commitments and really stand behind them for our consumers. Moving on, if that's okay, to the next slide. Helen's already touched on sort of how much work goes into trying to have a good track record and visibility over what's happening in the supply chain. And I guess I would start with saying there's always room for improvement. So whilst as a business we have a huge reputation for sort of leading the way in this space, I think we would also say that there's always more to do, and we are committing to do that, and to keep pushing the boundaries of sort of what is possible. So in terms of what it means in practice, I think leadership really is key. You have to make it easy for all levels of your business to make the right decision. And part of that is tone from the top and making sure that this is on everybody's agenda and it is visible across your kind of internal communication channels. But part of it is also around making sure it is a relevant metric that we are talking about. Helen mentioned tensions often between sustainability and procurement. It's much easier for procurement to win out if there is no kind of KPI or business-wide metric that rates sustainability as an important factor. So I think that is key. Governance, 44% of you thought that was the most important thing in this space. I would completely agree. I think governance and culture is key to landing change. We have, you can't have your kind of compliance committee off in a corner without any recognition that that is an important part of your governance structure. We have a sort of, as most businesses will, you have your audit and risk committee, you have a compliance committee, and we also have a dedicated ethics and sustainability committee chaired by an executive director. And that is where we bring together these concerns, and it is really a sort of force for change, both in terms of compliance to date, but also ambition going forwards. It's great to have that kind of dedicated forum. The culture piece is really important, and I think kind of flows out of governance and the visibility of these issues. You have to have a culture where bad news can travel upwards. If you've got too many people trying to solve things locally, you are never going to get that holistic view of issues in your supply chain. You need to be able to see micro, but also macro to really understand and temperature check where you are with your organisation. Sort of leading on from that is accountability. You have to be very clear where accountability for these issues sit. Is it in your commercial teams? Is it in your strategy team? Or does it sit somewhere else? Only with accountability can you kind of really go full cycle and have consequences for what you're seeing, and somebody who can make a decision. Ultimately, these are tough calls, as Helen mentioned. The final thing I was going to mention about leadership, it sort of ties into tone from the top, but for visibility of your supply chain and a real kind of gear change on these ESG credentials, you need investment in the relevant functions to do that. And that can only happen if your leadership are understanding the importance and willing to kind of ring fence that resource. A lot of businesses are under pressure right now, and looking at, headcount and budgets for next year. It's been a very difficult year for a lot of businesses, but I suppose cut your support functions at your peril if you really want to invest in these areas. I've mentioned in my second bullet there about contracting in the supplier life cycle, and I think this is, coming at it as a lawyer, a really key part of how we manage risk in our supply chain. It's obviously not the complete answer, because to a certain extent, a policy on a bit of paper isn't going to save a huge reputational scandal if that policy and bit of paper isn't actually being managed. But it does give you some protection and gets you a long way to sort of flushing out some issues. So just my reflections on this, thinking about sourcing, who are you inviting to the table, and how are you assessing them? How are you weighting your RFPs or your tender processes? Are you putting sustainability and compliance up there as a relevant factor that would actually help you make the decision between one supplier or another? Of course, we may not always have that luxury if there are not many suppliers in for a particular product, but I think it's really key that it is up there in the mix. Policies and processes and standards, we put a lot of effort into having our own kind of responsible sourcing codes. We want to go further than in many cases the legal requirements, because we think it's the right thing to do. And for us, the product mix is huge. It could be timber, it could be cashmere, it could be avocados, not even mentioning all of the goods not for resale that we source just to keep the shops running and the show on the road. So those policies have to be sort of necessarily broad, but you also need to have the expertise to make the specifications and standards for particular product lines appropriate. If you don't have those, it's much harder to kind of point back to things when things go wrong. Contracting, a good starting point is having a contract for all of your suppliers. I kind of say that with a smile, because well aware that that's not always possible and not every business does. Once you do have a contract, actually managing it, again, these sound like basics, but they are very hard to achieve, because you may not have the technology or the systems or even the capacity and capability to do that in your businesses. But you have to be looking at what you are seeing from your suppliers during the life of the contract. So that might be audit responses, that might just be something to do with requests for changes in payment terms. All of these signals and feedback loops will tell you something about how the supplier is how the supplier's business is going. And if they're under pressure, it might be giving you different signs that you need to investigate further. But acting on what you're hearing is really important. So starting with, you've got to listen and look. The final two bullets there are reporting and consequences. I suppose it really just flows on from that active contract management. As a business, it's really important to build into people's roles that this is an expectation. And again, capacity and capability when businesses are under pressure, to make sure that it can be given appropriate sort of airtime. The final bullet I just wanted to mention is internal collaboration. This is difficult, and I think it does take a bit of an army. So you'll have people working on it from across your sort of legal teams, CSR, government affairs, procurement, commercial teams. So personally, I think one of the biggest things as sort of a small in-house team we can do is build those relationships, have those conversations, connect the dots, because as a legal team, we're quite privileged to see lots of different things and a quite a holistic view. So I think we have a really important role to bring those strings together and make sure the relevant people are brought in to give their view on things. As always, things are normally easier when you talk, and we put kind of a high degree of emphasis on making sure that we have those relationships to really make the difference in this space. That was all I was going to mention for now. So I think, Helen, it's back to you, isn't it?
Great, thanks, Rebecca. That was really interesting, and I was scrolling down notes as you were speaking as well. You know, I thought particularly interesting about how you're weighting RFPs, and you know how that's a really sort of useful tip around. You know, if you have your policies, but then they're not actually reflected in the way that those RFPs are being weighted, that it's very unlikely they're going to actually translate through to decisions. So thank you for that. Just before we move on to Emma, we're going to run another poll. So can I just bring that up, please? Great, thank you. So please do vote in the poll. And this is one of the, I suppose, issues that Rebecca mentioned. You know, when you're considering ESG and supply chains, are you mainly concerned about managing risk for your business, or are you seeing it as a way of securing, if you like, a commercial benefit for the business? We'll just give a few minutes for everyone to vote. Okay, and if we close the poll now, please, and share the results. That's interesting. So mostly 78% saying you're mostly seeing this as a risk management exercise, and then 22% concern, you know, think that this is a way to, if you like, secure a commercial benefit. And I wonder, I think that may shift in years to come, and I suspect it depends a bit on which sector you're in as well, as to whether this is the sort of thing that your customers particularly care about or don't. But clearly quite a strong result there, that this is clearly seen as mainly a risk management issue at the moment. So with that, if we can move on to the next slide, and I'm going to hand over to Emma Mansbridge from the Food and Drink Federation. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Helen. Morning, everyone. My name's Emma, and I'm the Sustainability and Environmental Policy Executive at the Food and Drink Federation. This morning, I want to talk to you about our environmental ambition, Ambition 2025, and what we have achieved so far. And this includes our online platform, the FDF Sustainability Hub. I'm going to then present a case study from Kellogg's, one of our members, on how they are managing ESG in their European supply chain. And I'll finish by talking about government's recent due diligence consultation and our response. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction to the FDF and who we are. So the Food and Drink Federation is the voice of the UK food and drink manufacturing industry, the largest manufacturing sector in the country. We have just over 300 manufacturing members, and they range from global big brands to growing small businesses. We're the largest cross-sector membership body focused solely on food drink manufacturing. So we have categories including cereal, confectionery, snacks, bakery, seafood, frozen and beverages. And we also operate a range of other groups, including the Seafood Alliance, and work closely with government and other supply chain bodies. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction to our Ambition 2025, which is our environmental ambition. So the FDF's Ambition 2025, Shaping Sustainable Value Chains, builds on our previous environmental ambition of fivefold, and it's our next step on our journey to delivering a more sustainable food system. So we believe that a competitive and sustainable UK food and drink manufacturing sector has the potential to make a real contribution to future food security and sustainable growth. The proposal is composed of two elements. So we have the resource efficiency pillar and the shaping future value chains pillar. And just to note, we are currently undertaking a midterm review of the ambition. just to ensure that it's reflecting changes in the regulatory, political and economical landscape. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the two pillars of the ambition. So the resource efficiency pillar follows directly on from fivefold. And we updated the ambitions in areas focused on operational efficiency. Though I would say as time has gone on that remit has widened probably quite significantly, especially in areas such as food waste and water, where we're taking more of a farm to fork approach and working with suppliers more closely. And then the second pillar, shaping future value chains, was added when we launched the ambition in 2016. And it's focused more on collaboration with members and stakeholders to gather information and share knowledge that can help members make decisions to make their supply chains more sustainable. Next slide, please. So just quickly going to touch on the resource efficiency pillar and the sort of targets that we have under that. So we have the CO2 emissions target, which is a reduction of 55% by 2025 based on a 1990 baseline. We have a target to send zero food waste to landfill from members' own direct operations, and also to reduce food waste across the whole supply chain from farm to fork. We also have a target on packaging to minimise the impact of used packaging associated with food and drink products, and to encourage innovation in packaging technology. On water, we have a reduction target within the operation to contribute to a target to reduce water use by 20% across the industry, and also want to deliver continuous improvement in the use of water across the whole supply chain, and take action to ensure sustainable water management and stewardship. And then we also have targets around transport and reducing the impact of our members' transport operations, both from own fleet and third-party hauliers, looking at both carbon intensity and air quality. So to achieve these, we often work quite closely with external organisations such as WRAP, who have a link in with other supply chain bodies as well. Next slide, please. So to touch on the shaping future value chains pillar a bit more. So we want to promote the recognition and uptake of sustainability standards and initiatives in the food and drink sector to improve supply chains. And under this pillar, we often do a lot of work on palm oil, especially, working with the UK Roundtable on sourcing sustainable palm oil and government. And as part of midterm review discussions, it's become quite clear that members would like us to strengthen our work on this area of the ambition and go further. And we also work to increase awareness of natural capital amongst members, promoting the business benefits and supporting a shift towards integrating natural capital into decision making. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide is really just an illustration of what we've achieved so far. So we've come a long way since 2016, with notable reductions in CO2 emissions, water use and food waste within manufacturing operations. As I said, we often work with partners such as WRAP, who have access to the broader supply chain. And I think it's worth commenting here that increasingly with the National Food Strategy and the concept of sustainable healthy diets, thinking is definitely becoming more holistic, and there is a greater focus on the overall supply chain. For example, thinking around scope 3 emissions. So next slide, please. So under the Sustainable Supply Chains commitment, we have developed the FDF Sustainability Hub. And the hub aims to promote the recognition and uptake of sustainability standards and initiatives in the food sector. The hub was launched to FDF members and the public in January 2018, and it's an online platform containing comprehensive information on voluntary certifications, collaborative platforms and practical tools available to all businesses looking to further their sustainability agenda. So we now have about 104 initiatives listed on the hub. Examples include the Accountability Framework Initiative, B Corporation and Court Hold 2025. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to quickly run over a case study from Kellogg's. So this is from our 2019 progress report, so very recent. And Kellogg's have moved to responsibly sourced corn for all Kellogg's cornflakes sold across Europe, including the UK. So the criteria to determine whether the corn is responsibly sourced are grouped into 3 categories, and they are environmental, social, and governance. And it's part of their commitment to responsibly source its top 10 priority ingredients by 2020. So some examples of environmental criteria include 100% of the use of acres used to produce corn for Kellogg's cornflakes are measured against the criteria with the goal of demonstrating continuous improvement. Farmers have to implement conservation practices, use cover crops, buffer strips, conservation irrigation practices. And social criteria, one example is that 100% of the workers on the farm have access to regular health and safety training. Next slide, please. So very quickly going to give a broad brush overview of the due diligence consultation that the UK government put out on the 25th of August. The consultation closed on the 5th of October. And was seeking views on whether government should introduce a new law designed to prevent forests and other natural areas from being converted, illegally into agricultural land. So overall, FDF and our members are supportive of government's proposal to have a system of due diligence in place. However, there are some concerns about how this would work in practice. And we think it's important to recognise that this issue cannot be solved in isolation, and we need a collaborative approach that involves all relevant stakeholders. So one of the main proposals was that DEFRA would use legality as the means. FDF is concerned that government hasn't yet stated which laws they will consider to be relevant and how potential future laws will be captured, monitored and enforced. And it's important for government to recognise where legislation at national level falls short and where relevant laws and standards do not align, and to recognise the efforts of companies who are following higher standards. It's also important to think about how laws can differ between producer governments, sometimes for the same commodity, which can make this quite complex. As government is targeting larger companies at the moment, we would expect most of those to have their own corporate commitments in place. And these could be linked to existing standards or certification schemes which already go beyond what is legally required. We also flagged that government wants the UK to lead the way and influence the international community through opportunities as COP26. So therefore, you could assume that the ultimate aim is to see producing countries go further and move faster, and this needs to be accounted for. We also flagged that another key issue for our members is traceability to farms within supply chains. This is a challenge that the whole industry faces and that does not currently have a solution. On transparency, we feel that a due diligence system needs to be as simple and transparent as possible, and therefore would support mandatory reporting. However, there is a role for agreed metrics in this area, and we think the government should maybe think about working with a body such as Innovate UK to agree some metrics. Once the system is defined, the FDF would also expect government to introduce a transition period to allow businesses to prepare in light of COVID and Brexit. On sanctions, again, FDF would expect there to be a clear methodology, and also for an enforcement body to be chosen who have the resources, mandate and expertise to provide guidance and monitor the uptake of due diligence. Sanctions need to be proportionate, and government also needs to be clear on the purpose and level of potential fines, including how any money collected would be used. Government also needs to be clear on where in the supply chain they would want fines to be applied. On defining large businesses, FDS recommendation was that government should consider traded volume among other thresholds. because this would ensure that any business captured will have a significant level of influence on that commodity supply chain. So whilst consideration should be given to the financial and administrative capacity of SME businesses to meet due diligence, this should not be an open channel for illegal products to enter the UK. Ensuring a cut-off date will be critical for businesses, and government support on that is welcome. And another concern is around clarity on embedded commodities, for example, secondary commodities like imported soy-fed meat and seafood products, or tertiary commodities like gelatin derived from pig skins. The proposed regulation is mirrored in the EU farm to fork strategy, and that's something that needs to be recognised. And also it's not guaranteed that all devolved administrations will implement this. So in terms of what's next, the timeline for secondary legislation is unknown, except that we should expect another public consultation, and that will be longer than 6 weeks. We expect this to be a part of a wider package of measures based on the global resource recommendations. And we think there's some questions to be asked about what this could mean in the long term and any unintended consequences, such as potential impacts on other ecosystems or movements away from commodities such as sustainable palm oil. And that was it from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. There was so much there. It was so interesting. I think a couple of things that jumped out for me were, you know, about the statistics that you're talking about for the food and drink sector, and how, you know, for these to be meaningful commitments, they need to be, you know, quite specific KPIs, as you say. So, you know, 20% reduction in water use. Was it zero food waste to landfill was the target as well? Yeah, which is, you know, an incredibly stretching target. And you can see that behind each of those commitments, there will be an enormous amount of work actually that needs to be done within the industry to achieve those. And on the forest risk products, you know, that's a really interesting consultation. And I think you're absolutely right to raise the points that you have around traceability. That is something I know from advising on palm oil and biofuels as well, that traceability of supply chains incredibly difficult to do, particularly for commingled products, and also around enforcement as well. You know, I'll be interested to see how the government intends to enforce this. We saw with the Modern Slavery Act that the government has taken a very light touch approach to enforcement on that. So really, if you don't comply with the Modern Slavery Act, mainly the sanctions are commercial sanctions. You know, people might not, you might be named and shamed by an NGO, or you might, you know, not be able to win a particular contract if you haven't got a modern slavery statement. But we don't see much government enforcement. You know, it'd be interesting to see if this is any different. But thank you for that. I thought that was really interesting. So if we now stop sharing the slides and we'll go into our Q&A section. We've had a couple of questions come through, so thank you very much for those. The first one that I thought would be interesting is around components, and a question around the supply chain risk in manufacturing of goods will often be component risk, where the components are made in different parts of the world by those further down the supply chain with different lead times. You know, how do you manage continuity of supply, but also how do you think about those kind of ESG issues when you're thinking about those kind of supply chains? I don't know if that's one, Rebecca, that you've got any thoughts on.
I mean, it's incredibly difficult. Dealt with this recently with some product recalls where because of high risk products, and the supplier that we've worked for years and years has done the same thing, but somebody somewhere in the supply chain has, you know, changed a spring in a mattress, and the mattress is no longer safe, and you have to recall them. And then you think, gosh, if that bit of the component is wrong in that mattress, maybe it's wrong in every single mattress, and you've got to suddenly start a process of retesting and trying to track through kind of what changed at what point. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I think it's very difficult. I think it's working with suppliers that you know and trust and build long-term relationships with, because then they can help you be part of the solution in how you trace further up the supply chain.
Yeah, and is that something that comes up for you, Emma? It's probably more, I guess, raw materials, is it, for food and drink?
Yeah, but I would agree. The close relationship with the people that you're working with and the suppliers that you're working with is key to getting those connections and getting those contacts further down the supply chain and identifying where that issue might have occurred.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. We've got another one here around embedding the principles of ESG into core business, but noting that we are obviously in very difficult economic times, and that people might see ESG as being optional, basically. You know, can we afford to care about this kind of thing when we're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis? And I guess that's linked to the poll question that we had earlier on around, you know, is this a managing risk thing or is this a commercial issue? I mean, what's your take on it from the John Lewis stand, would you say, Rebecca?
I mean, it's really difficult and different, coming back to this idea of different stakeholder groups, different people think different things. So yeah. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention Boohoo, but obviously there's been a huge amount of press this week about the auditors pulling out, and I'm sure that has it's had a huge impact on the share price, and investors will be thinking very differently about the business. But then you question, what does the end consumer think about all of this? Do they care about the auditors? Probably not. You know, I think Boohoo saw a 27% increase in number of customers over the 2020 financial year, which again makes you think, well, maybe different groups think about this in a different way. So I think a really important way of bringing it back to making it part of the core narrative of business in challenging economic times is the communication story. And obviously, as a lawyer, I won't profess to be an expert in that, but really translating all of the efforts into something meaningful for your customers, so they want to invest in you as a brand and what you as a brand stand for. We were talking as a group yesterday and sort of mentioned, you know, things like plastic straws get a huge amount of airtime, and plastic bags, you know, take them out of the shops, and the consumers really want that because it's visible, it's tangible. Whereas when you're talking about kind of back office stuff, and, you know, maybe carbon from your supply chain, it's much harder to make it meaningful. So for me, there's a really important comms narrative that has to go alongside all of this.
Yeah. And for those that the Boohoo story was also that they were connected with low paid workers in garment factories in Leicester. There was quite a big scandal about it. They commissioned an external report, and interestingly, the report found that that Boohoo themselves hadn't committed any offences, were not, you know, if you like, guilty of any sort of wrongdoing as a corporate entity. Where there was criticism, I think, was around this idea of turning a blind eye, and I think that links back to some of the points we were saying about leadership and about what your culture is around this as well, and making sure that people are able to hear bad news and to act on it. What's your take on it, Emma? You know, the food and drink sector is fighting on a few different fronts at the moment, aren't you? And so is this something that is, you know, you think is still priority for your members, or is it something that's on the back burner? How are people seeing it at the moment?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it does somewhat depend on your company's outlook and ethos. And again, that communications part plays a big role. You know, plastics and packaging, we saw really caught the imagination of the consumer. And sort of went a bit full speed ahead, definitely, and companies taking action on that. And we saw the establishment of the UK Plastics Pact and these commitments coming in. But these are long-term commitments. We don't want any unintended consequences, I would say, whereas I think some of the pressures for our industry at the moment are very immediate. You've got COVID, you've got Brexit. So I think for a lot of businesses, it's a fact of dealing with that now, thinking about these sustainabilities and the ESG slightly more longer term. And I don't think it's going away. I mean, you have so many targets in place. You've got Court Hold 2025, which a number of food and drink businesses are signed up to. You've got the UN SDGs. You've got net zero by 2050. There are tangible targets that a lot of businesses will be expected to meet, both by consumers and by government, and internally. They will have their own commitments in place. So I think keeping those commitments and making sure that you're still looking at those and working towards those is a massive part of this.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you think that your clients, your members are being driven by consumer pressure on this, or sort of other stakeholder pressure? What do you think is the kind of the main drive, if you like, for them on things like sustainability?
I think it's a mix. I think consumer pressure is probably the biggest one.
Yeah.
Consumers put pressure on other areas of the supply chain as well, particularly retailers.
Yeah.
And retailers then take that back to their suppliers and will put sort of standards in place or make demands upon their suppliers to meet certain scope, for example, scope 3 emissions. So I think it's very driven by the consumer, and it's great that the consumer is so interested in this at the moment. And I think perhaps the consumer is less worried about no deal Brexit than my members are in terms of the financial impact. So I think it should keep coming, that pressure should keep coming from the consumer. But I think, again, the challenge is what captures their imagination and what is visible to them. So plastics and packaging is a really visible issue. Whereas climate change, I think, and water availability as well is a big one. They're not so visible, so they're not so pushed from that level.
Yes, but actually it might be that the impact can be greater in dealing with some, you know, in doing something like reducing water usage, that the overall environmental benefit might be much greater than, as you say, something particular focused on plastic, but that might be what consumers are pushing for at the moment. And what about the John Lewis side, Rebecca? Would you say, is it again responding to consumer pressure, or is it sort of wider investor or other stakeholders as well?
I think it's a bit of a mix for us, because we our founding purpose has a social aspect to it. So I won't bore you with the history of the partnership, but our founder, John Speed and Lewis, did want to prove it was possible to have a better way of doing business and make only sufficient profit, not maximum profit, to reinvest back into the communities and your employees. So for us, it's definitely a hybrid.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's probably quite unique.
Yeah, and I think it does reflect that unique model, doesn't it? We've got one final poll question, I think, before we end, so I'll just move to that now. And I know there's quite a few questions we haven't had time to address, but if you can just vote on that poll question on the screen, and what we will try and do is publish some answers to some of the questions that we didn't get time to address during the session, and we'll put them up on LinkedIn. So which statement best describes your company's approach to ESG and supply chains? We don't really consider it. We consider it to a certain extent, but have limited visibility and control on these issues in our supply chains, or we invest considerable time and resource into this area and have strong processes and controls. Okay, and if we just close the poll now, Jodie, and share the results. That's interesting. So so most of you feel that this is being taken into account to a certain extent, but with limited visibility and control on those issues. And 13% thought that you are, if you like, stronger on that, so you're able to invest considerable time and resource into this and have strong processes. And only 6% of you said you don't consider ESG factors really at all when managing your supply chain. So it's definitely a factor for the vast majority of you, but to a different extent. Well, we've hit 10 o'clock, so I'm very conscious of everyone's time. A huge thank you to Emma and to Rebecca for your time and for your really interesting insights this morning. Thank you to all the attendees for joining. As I say, with a recording of this will be available on our website. We'll try and address some of the questions as well afterwards. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for joining us.